The only item bearing a cartouche with the name Tutankhaten that does not originate from KV 62 his tomb in western Thebes is a lunette from a small limestone stela, which Ludwig Burchard and Friedrich Wilhelm von Bissing donated to the Egyptian Museum in Berlin at the end of the 19th century. Only the left half of the lunette, showing figures of the gods Ammon and his consort Mut, survived the destruction of the Second World War. Since Ammon and Mut are present, it's likely that the stela came from Thebes, the primary center of Ammon's worship, rather than from Ammon. However, the exact location where it was found remains unknown. The king is identified as Tutankhaten. He is shown wearing a long pleated robe with a sash, along with the blue crown adorned with streamers. He is depicted offering flowers to enthroned deities labeled Amun-Re, king of the gods, and Mut, lady of heaven, mistress of the gods. When Adolf Erman published the stela in the early 20th century, he noted that its artistic style matched the Amarna period. He also observed that the artist behind the piece seemed unfamiliar with traditional depictions of gods. Rather than portraying them with the solemn dignity typical of earlier periods, the sculptor gave them expressions that appeared amused. However, what Erman interpreted as a lack of seriousness in the gods' faces likely reflects the sculptor's lack of skill. One detail in Mut's attire supports this view. She is shown wearing a Modisa flat-topped crown with double falcon feathers, an unusual choice for a goddess. This type of headdress was generally associated with queens, especially during the Amarna period. Inscribed for the young king, while he was still known as Tutankhaten, are two thrones. These pieces have survived into modern times because they were placed in his tomb along with other possessions he used during his lifetime. One of them, an inlaid ebony throne object, No. 351, was nicknamed the Ecclesiastical Throne by Howard Carter, as its shape reminded him of a bishop's chair from European cathedrals. Although the name persisted, there is no actual connection between the throne and any priestly function of the king. Unlike the golden throne object, the ebony throne has received far less attention and appreciation. Despite its refined design and outstanding craftsmanship, by two side posts and a central braccia construction style known from preserved chairs dating back to the Middle Kingdom. It also mimics the form of a folding stool. Chairs of this kind, even those that imitated folding ones like Tutankhaten's, were not limited to royal use. Reliefs and paintings from as early as the reign of Amenhotep III through to the Ramesside period show officials seated on similar furniture. Decorative elements such as goose-shaped legs and the depiction of cowhide draped over the seat also appear on furniture associated with non-royal individuals. However, the throne's royal character is unmistakable. The presence of a frieze of cobras wearing sun discs along the headrail, as well as a vulture with outstretched wings beneath it, clearly signals its connection to kingship. The decoration of the backrest avoids figures and instead features a pattern of alternating ebony and ivory niches. Borrowing from architectural motifs, this lack of human or divine figures might explain why the radiant sun disk, a central element in Akhenaten's iconography of the Atanas, missing from this throne. In contrast, the golden throne shows the sun disk shining upon the royal couple, which contained the so-called didactic name of the solar god in the form Akhenaten, introduced later in his reign. The king is referred to as. On the front, the same name appears in the cartouches topped with sun discs beneath the headrail, as well as on the vertical ivory inlays. However, the two horizontal ebony strips use a different form, identifying him as the perfect god, Tutankhamun. Observing this inconsistency in names, Howard Carter suggested that the young kings shift back to the older. Theban religion was a gradual process, rather than a sudden change. Later research has proposed that these ebony strips were later additions, possibly replacing earlier ones that originally bore the name Tutankhaten. One of the most telling features in the inscriptions helpful in determining that the ebony throne predates the golden one knees, the appearance of the title perfect ruler on three vertical ebony strips. As previously discussed regarding the coffin from KV 55, Akhenaten had introduced perfect ruler as a replacement for the traditional royal epithet perfect god. The presence of this title on the ebony throne indicates that it was still In use early in Tutankhaten's reign, though likely only for a short time, by the time the gold throne was created, the traditional title Perfect God had been reinstated. While the gold throne's inscriptions still refer to the king as Tutankhaten, they use the older restored title Perfect God, which also appears on the updated horizontal ebony strips attached to the front of the ebony throne. The golden throne has been widely discussed and photographed in countless books on ancient Egypt, particularly those focused on the Amarna period or on Tutankhamun himself. When Carter and Mace first published their findings, they pointed out the presence of both early and later forms of the king's name in the texts. Tutankhaten appears on the side supports and the center brace, holding up the backrest as well, as in the inlaid cartouche on the outside of the right armrest. In contrast, the name Tutankhamun crafted in the goldsmithing technique known as chasing is found in the gold foil cartouches inside the left armrest and in the inscriptions, identifying the figures in the scene on the backrest's front. Just as with the ebony throne, this unusual mix of names was understood to reflect the religious and political fluctuations that marked the king's reign. Asterisk, in the mid-1970s, Egyptologists began to take a closer look at the golden throne and started to question whether King Tutankhaten was its original owner. Suspicions arose due to apparent modifications in the decoration and noticeable alterations in the cartouches, leading some to believe the throne may have been originally made for one of his predecessors. Additionally, even to a casual observer, it is clear that the throne is sized for an adult rather than a child. The seat stands approximately 52 centimeters, high about one ancient Egyptian cubit, making it the tallest chair known. From the Pharaonic period, however, this impressive scale, like the elaborate decoration, likely reflects the high status of the owner rather than his physical size or age. Moreover, when Tutankhaten ascended the throne, who could have known that his reign would be so short? Some assert that the king appears more like Akhenaten, although there is no consensus on the identity of the queen. Some suggest she may have originally been Nefertiti or Kia. Building on this idea, researcher Gaboldi interpreted a line from Tutankhamun's so-called restoration stela to mean the gold throne once belonged to Akhenaten, since it mentions the king sitting on his father's throne. However, the father referred to in that inscription is Amen, not Akhenaten. The text repeatedly names Amen as the deity who fathered Tutankhamun and to whom the king devoted offerings and restored worship. Asterisk, in my analysis, I noted that the profiles of the king and queen in the throne's backrest, sign-crafted from red glass, are nearly identical, like mirror images. Yet in other scenes that portray Tutankhamun with his queen, such as those on the small golden shrine object, No. 108, their features vary significantly. In one depiction, they may look very similar, while in another, they appear quite different from each other. In ancient Egypt, it was a close relative. As was the case for Tutankhaten, till a distinctive portrait style was developed specifically for him. So it would not be unusual if the figure of the king on the golden throne bears a strong resemblance to Akhenaten, possibly his father or uncle. The changes made to the names of the king and queen on the gold throne involved only replacing the hieroglyphs for Aten, or Pa-Aten in the queen's case, with those for Amen. To carry out this modification quickly, the gold foil cartouches containing the Aten or Pa-Aten signs were smoothed down and then re-engraved. This process is particularly noticeable in the queen's cartouche. Normally, the name Pa-Aten appears last at the bottom-in vertical cartouches, as can still be seen in her cartouche on the center brace at the back of the throne. However, the standard spelling of Ankhesenamun prioritizes the god's name, placing Amen at the top of a vertical cartouche. On the gold throne's backrest scene, the queen's cartouche uniquely positions Amen toward the bottom, followed by the hieroglyph of a seated woman to indicate her gender. Filling the space originally taken by Pa-Tatan, the Aten names of the royal couple on the styles and the center brace behind the backrest were likely left unchanged, since these parts were not normally visible. Likewise, the inlaid cartouche naming the king as Tutankhaten on the outside of the right armrest was also left intact, possibly because the craftsman, updating the cartouches, chose not to create new inlays. Unlike the altered cartouches What may appear to be changes to the figures and the scene on the backrest can be explained as ancient repairs made to damage sustained through use. There are clear signs of wear and tear, indicating that the throne was not crafted solely for a single event such as a coronation. Royal and non-royal reliefs and paintings from the 18th dynasty show pharaohs owning at least 2 armchairs similar to the gold throne, often depicted on the deck of the royal barge or carried on platforms as portable chairs. However, the gold throne lacks the usual knee braces that strengthen the legs, making it less sturdy and unsuitable for these functions. Most likely, it was used during court feasts, which were significant social occasions. The scene on the backrest, which appears to show the queen offering the king a drink in a goblet, may have symbolized the royal couple's presence at such events when they were physically absent. Asterisk. Several other objects from Tutankhamun's tomb that bear his original name include ornamental gold appliques for bows, a scribe's palette, and 2 writing boards. The staff identified as Object No. 227B is also part of this group. The inscriptions along the shaft of the staff now read Tutankhamun. In Howard Carter's transcription, he noted that the later name replaced the earlier one in at least one instance, and possibly in the second as well. This type of staff is closely linked to military activity, which aligns perfectly with the texts inscribed on it. These inscriptions repeatedly praise the pharaoh's strength and emphasize his skill in conquering Egypt's enemies. Both columns of text begin with the title Perfect Ruler, followed by an epithet describing the king as appearing in the white crown, a phrase commonly found in Akhenaten's inscriptions. Another epithet likens the owner to Akhenaten's deity, referring to him as Lord of Appearances like Aten. The staff's craftsmanship and materials closely resemble those of the so-called Bow of Honor, Object No. 48 hours found in the tomb's antechamber. Although the staff and bow were not discovered together, the staff was found in the treasury. They may originally have belonged to a set. According to John R. Harris, the cartouche bearing the prenomen on the bow underwent 2 alterations. First, it was changed to Ankeper, beloved of Neferkheper, a reference to Akhenaten, and then later to Nebkeper, which is Tutankhamun's prenomen. The staff may have similarly passed through multiple owners. The remaining traces of Aten in the altered cartouches might not belong to Tutankhaten's inscriptions at all. Additionally, 74 embossed gold appliques were found with the chariots in the antechamber of KV 62, located just inside the tomb's entrance. These appliques are believed to have once decorated harnesses and other chariot equipment. More than half of these ornaments bear the king's name. While some show only the prenomen, most feature paired cartouches. 6 of them specifically contain the earlier nomen, Tutankhaten. Nearly 15 of the more than 40 bows found in the tomb are self-bows, while the rest are composite bows constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew. Among these 4 composite bows, bearing cartouches with the name Tutankhaten objects, No. 48F, 48I 2 examples, and 48J 1 or 2 examples, do not differ in size from the others. In other words, they are neither unusually small nor especially suited for use by a child. These bows were discovered, together with 17 bows and 16 staves, arranged on a bed placed atop the lion-headed bier along the west wall of the antechamber. Of the remaining 13 bows, 5 bear the unaltered name Tutankhamun, while one, the so-called Bow of Honor mentioned earlier, shows signs of 2 modifications, indicating it likely passed through to owners before coming into Tutankhamun's possession. The writing boards inscribed with the earlier nomen were both found on the floor of the annex and differ only slightly in size. Each board consists of a hardwood base about 7 millimeters thick, covered with a layer of stucco over linen to provide a surface for gilding gold for object No. 387 and silver for object No. 398. These 2 boards clearly form a matching set and were probably intended for ceremonial use. A similar purpose might be assumed for the scribe's palette object No. 271EE, even though the ink pats on it suggest it was used practically. This palette was found in a box within the treasury, which also contained a second palette, a reed, pen holder, and a tool commonly described as a papyrus burnisher on identification proposed by Carter. The inscription on the palette refers to Tutankhaten as beloved of Thoth, Lord of Sacred Writings. The text includes the king's Horus name, along with a pair of cartouches bearing his personal name, Tutankhaten, and his throne name. So far, no complete 5-part royal protocol has been discovered bearing the original name, although many examples exist with the altered name Tutankhamun. It remains possible, though perhaps unlikely, that the full royal titulary was only established and publicly proclaimed following the change of the king's name. Asterisk, asterisk. As noted in previous chapters, the revival of Amun's cult had already begun before Tutankhaten ascended the throne. However, it is clear that during Tutankhamun's reign, a wide range of projects were brought to completion, projects that his immediate predecessors would have scarcely been able to initiate, let alone complete. Egyptologists often point to the inscription carved on a striking quartzite stela standing 2.25 meters tall and housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This text marked a definitive and public break from the Amarna period. Rather than laying out plans or future goals, the inscription offers a retrospective account of what had already been achieved by the time it was written. In essence, it does not introduce the beginning of a restoration program, but instead presents it as a mission already fulfilled in 1905. French archaeologist Georges Legrain uncovered the stela in the northeast corner of the hypostyle hall at Karnak Temple. 2 fragments of another stela bearing the same inscription were also found at the Montu Temple, located just outside the northern enclosure wall of Karnak. Legrain discovered one of these fragments shortly before unearthing the nearly complete stela, and a second fragment came to light during excavations at the Montu Temple in 1940. It would not be surprising if more stelae or fragments containing the same text are found elsewhere in the future, perhaps near ancient Memphis. The nearly complete stela, now in Cairo, displays its inscription written from left to right, a reversal of the usual orientation of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This reversed layout suggests that it may have been one half of a matching pair. In contrast, the fragments from the Montu Temple are inscribed in the typical right-to-left direction, but they are unlikely to have come from the corresponding piece of the Cairo stele. This is evident from the fact that the distinctive frieze of pinioned lapwings with human arms raised in adoration, located beneath the final line of text on the complete stela, does not appear on the fragments. Friezes featuring the lapwing symbol were commonly used as decorative dado elements in New Kingdom temples, particularly in areas open to the general public. Although such decoration is rare on stelae, it does appear on examples from the reign of Amenhotep III and on one commissioned by Horemhab for Amenhotep III's mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes. It is also seen on another large stela that was ordered in Tutankhamun's name for Karnak, but left unfinished at his death. The presence of the lapwing motif on these steles suggests they were publicly visible and not restricted to elite access. The stelae of Amenhotep III and Horemhab were both found in secondary locations, and the original position of Tutankhamun's unfinished stela at Karnak remains unknown. However, it is likely that the complete restoration stela originally stood in front of Pylon III at Karnak Temple, near where it was later discovered, accessible to the public in Tutankhamun's time. In its design, the restoration stela shows lapwings venerating a pair of cartouches at the center of the frieze. These originally enclosed Tutankhamun's throne name and personal name, although all cartouches on the stela, including those in the vertical lines of text along its narrow sides, were later altered to bear Horemhab's name. 3 elements of Tutankhamun's original 5-part titulary were left unchanged within: the main body of the inscription in the balanced layout of the lunette figure 11, and Khezen-Aman originally stood behind Tutankhamun, who is shown presenting offerings to Amun and Mut. Today, the only surviving evidence of the queen's presence includes the tips of the double plumes from her headdress at the left edge of the lunette, partial traces of her titles, beginning with Great Royal Wife, Mistress of the Two Lands, and the lower portion of her cartouche now blank. Located beside the streamers of the blue crown that fall over Tutankhamun's shoulder plate, it's possible that Ankhesenaten once played a ritual role by shaking a sistrum, much like Queen Tai is shown doing with Amenhotep III. A protective inscription, designed to ward off threats approaching from behind the king, was carved into a plaster layer applied over the damaged surface, where the queen once appeared. This standard formula likely replaced her image. At the same time, the main text was overwritten in favor of Horemheb. The depictions of Amun-Re, king of the gods, and Mut, mistress of Isharuso, identified by the accompanying labels, follow traditional iconography. Mut is shown with a double crown atop a tripartite wig and a uraeus. She embraces Ammon with one arm and holds an ankh in the other. Ammon also holds an ankh with another attached to the end of a scepter that he extends toward Tutankhamun. Nozan established gesture seen in royal iconography since the Middle Kingdom. While the representations of the gods are consistent, the two images of the king differ. On the left, Tutankhamun wears the blue crown and offers floral bouquets, while on the right, he dons the royal Nenes headcloth and lifts a vessel for pouring. The right side lacks the refined detail evident on the left. The proportions of the figures show no trace of Amarna style art, in contrast to those on the Berlin Stele lunette, see Figure 5. Instead, the artistic style reflects the typical aesthetics of Tutankhamun's reign, as seen in the reliefs of the Colonnade Hall at Luxor Temple cf. Plate 17, which were clearly not produced in the early years of his rule. The only surviving part of the date introducing the inscription reads 4th month of the inundation season, day 19, with the regnal year missing. The usurped cartouches, now bearing the name Horemheb, beloved of Amun, originally contained Tutankhamen's name, from which the god's name Amun was retained. This indicates the stela was created after the king had changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, although exactly when that occurred before his 4th regnal year is still uncertain. Nevertheless, the date may not be critical. Tutankhamun's full titulary is accompanied by a range of epithets that link him to several traditional deities. Reflecting on the gender dynamics within the text, John Baines highlights the inclusion of both goddesses and gods as a defining element of the composition. In this regard, one might recall a relevant passage from Akhenaten's earlier proclamation inscribed on the boundary steelers at Tel El Amarna. In that declaration, Akhenaten states that the site he selected for establishing his new capital in Middle Egypt belonged to neither a god nor a goddess, neither a male nor a female ruler. The inscription of the Restoration Stela begins with a description of the condition of Egypt at the time of Tutankhamun's accession, the temples and cities dedicated to the gods and goddesses, from Elephantine all the way to the marshes of the delta, had fallen into disrepair. Their sanctuaries were in ruins, reduced to overgrown mounds of earth. Sacred spaces were treated as though they had never existed, and temple buildings had become mere pathways as the land itself was in utter chaos. The gods had turned away from Egypt. When armies were sent to Jayi to expand Egypt's borders, they failed. Prayers went unanswered. Neither gods nor goddesses responded when called upon. The divine spirits had grown weak in their forms and had destroyed what once was built. This passage has traditionally been interpreted as a direct reference to the religious upheaval brought about by Akhenaten's reforms, an idea that has persisted among scholars. In the mid-19th century, a similar text from the post-Amarna period was recorded by a Prussian expedition describing King A's intention to restore a temple of the god Min at Akhmim that had also fallen into decay. Likewise, Horemheb's coronation inscription speaks of new statues and the rebuilding of damaged sanctuaries. However, caution is warranted in interpreting such texts as direct commentary on Akhenaten's religious policies. In Egyptian tradition, it was common for a new king to be credited with restoring cosmic and social order, a literary theme that predates even the Middle Kingdom. Detlef Frank noted that this rhetorical pattern stretches back many generations, even if the passage about decay and destruction alludes to the time of Akhenaten. Interpreting the final lines as references to the defilement of divine images during the so-called heresy may be overstated. While resources were certainly redirected from other temples to support Otun's cult, it is now well understood that Akhenaten did not close all temples to traditional deities, nor were the images and names of all gods systematically destroyed throughout Egypt. The aggressive suppression primarily targeted the Theban gods Amun, Mut, and, to a lesser extent, Montu, largely because their worship was deeply intertwined with Thebes, the former religious center. In Thebes, even other deities suffered, simply by virtue of their association with Amen. Outside Thebes, restoration mainly involved reinscribing the name of Amun, where it had been erased, especially in the personal names of past kings, and repairing the god's damaged representations. That the restoration stela emphasizes Amen so prominently reflects the urgent need to reinstate him to the dominant role he had held before Akhenaten's reforms, particularly since it was his cult that had been most severely targeted. In the main body of the restoration stela's inscription, the only other deity mentioned by name as receiving royal benefaction, apart from Amen's Ptah, the creator god and protector of craftsmen. The two epithets used to describe him, South of his wall and Lord of Ankhtoe, identify him with Memphis, the city where his cult was based. Ptah's inclusion, in contrast to all other gods besides Amen, is explained by a separate passage in the text. At the time, Tutankhamun decided to offer gifts to his father, Amen. He was residing in a palace originally built by Thutmose I at Memphis. It was therefore fitting that Memphis's chief deity would be mentioned alongside Amen as a recipient of royal generosity. If the gifts were of lesser magnitude, for example, Ptah's new processional bark was to be carried by 11 poles, compared to 13 for Amen's, according to the inscription. Electrum, adorned with lapis lazuli, turquoise, and every precious stone was used to create new images of Amen, Ptah, and other unnamed deities. Temples were reconstructed and endowed to ensure the continued performance of daily offerings. Standard elements in texts of this nature, the king also claimed he appointed priests to maintain ritual services, assigned maidservants of the palace to serve as singers and dancers in the temples, and provided slaves described as from the tribute of his persons capturing to labor in the temple workshops. These individuals have often been identified as prisoners of war, supposedly captured during military actions undertaken by Tutankhamun or his generals. However, such claims should not necessarily be taken at face value. For instance, Amenhotep III, whose reign saw only a single known military campaign in Nubium, made a similar declaration about assigning children of the chiefs of every foreign land. Captured during his campaigns to work in his mortuary temple, these kinds of statements appear to have been conventional phrases rather than factual accounts of warfare. Notably, Tutankhamun's restoration stela does not refer to the restoration of monuments using the technical term smoi menu. In fact, very few inscriptions from his reign include this expression, which only gained widespread use during the time of Seti I, the second king of Dynasty 19. There is no known evidence of images or inscriptions being recarved due to damage sustained. During Akhenaten's reign prior to the change of the king's name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, the remainder of this chapter focuses on such restoration activities that can be confidently attributed to Tutankhamun's rule. Nearly all of the limited inscriptions that use the term smoi menu to credit restoration efforts to Tutankhamun are located in temples at Thebes. While additional restoration work has been linked to his reign based on stylistic elements, many Egyptologists are hesitant to accept such attributions purely on the basis of style. Reliefs ordered by I and by Horemheb in the early years of his reign often closely resemble the mature artistic style of Tutankhamun's later period. Likewise, distinguishing statues of Amun made under Tutankhamun from those of his immediate successors is frequently impossible. Nonetheless, there are a number of restored reliefs depicting Amun that include inscriptions crediting Horemheb or Seti I, which reveal that earlier phases of restoration had been subsequently modified. While such examples are not uncommon, they have only recently drawn scholarly attention. Egyptologist Peter J. Brand has examined this phenomenon and introduced the term secondary restoration to describe it. Brand persuasively argues that Tutankhamun was likely responsible for the original restoration work that was later revised by Horemheb or Seti I, according to Gaboldi. Horemheb may have ordered such alterations as a way to legitimize his appropriation of inscriptions originally dedicated to Tutankhamun. Brand further suggests that Seti I specifically had the faces of certain human-headed deities recarved so they would no longer reflect Tutankhamun's official likeness. There is just one known inscription beyond the Theban region that explicitly credits Tutankhamun by name with restoration work. It demonstrates that restoration under his authority reached far southward, extending beyond Egypt's traditional southern boundary. During the later part of the 18th dynasty, Egypt maintained strong control over the Upper Nile Valley. The official responsible for overseeing this vast region held the title King's Son of Cush. Although he was not Pharaoh's biological descendant, his jurisdiction extended from the area around the Fourth Cataract and the site of Jebel Barkal occupied by Egyptians since at least the reign of Thutmose III downstream to Hierakonpolis. This area reached well into Egypt's traditional southern boundary at Aswan, likely to encompass not only Nubian gold mines but also those in Upper Egypt. Viceroy, in Nubia, is particularly well known due to the vibrant wall paintings found in his tomb at western Thebes. These murals depict both Egyptian and Egyptianized Nubian officials who were involved in the governance of Nubia at the time. With many individuals identified by name at Jebel Barkal, evidence of the Amarna period survives in the form of references to Ammon in earlier 18th dynasty inscriptions, along with a notable quantity of talatat blocks. These small stone blocks, measuring about 52 by 26 by 23 centimeters, were typical of Akhenaten's building projects at Thebes and Tel El Amarna. Designed for efficiency, talatat were light enough to be handled by a single worker, allowing rapid progress on his large-scale construction efforts. Some of these blocks were discovered reused in later structures, and by the end of 2013, a number of decorated talatat emerged that had been incorporated into a small chapel built by at Jebel Barkal. This suggests that restoration efforts may have begun under Tutankhamun's reign. One of a pair of recumbent lion statues found at Jebel Barkal bears the name of Tutankhamun. However, additional inscriptions on both lions clearly indicate that they only arrived at the site many centuries after Tutankhamun's death. These slightly larger-than-life statues were transported to Jebel Barkal by a ruler of the kingdom of Napata during the 3rd century BCE. It remains uncertain whether they came directly from Amenhotep III's temple at Soleb, located further north below the Third Cataract, where they originally stood, or from an intermediate location. In the 19th century, the lions completed their long journey when Lord Prudhoe, the 4th Duke of Northumberland, gifted them to the British Museum in London in 1835. The two lions are nearly identical in design, size, artistic style, and craftsmanship, leaving little doubt that they were created as a matched pair. One of them bears an inscription on its chest, originally interpreted as stating that King Tutankhamen's successor arranged for the lion's transfer and placement at Soleb. The other lion appears to have reached Soleb during Amenhotep III's lifetime. However, Mark Gaboldi has re-examined the inscription and concluded that it was not but rather Akhenaten, when he was still known as Amenhotep, who claimed credit for sending the lion to Soleb. It has long been understood that Akhenaten carried out work at his father's temple at Soleb, inserting his own presence into its decorations. Shortly before his death, William J. Mernon presented new evidence suggesting that Akhenaten's activity at Soleb dates to the very start of his reign, while he still used the name Amenhotep IV. Afterward, the cartouches with the name Amenhotep were altered to read Akhenaten, and following his death, they were changed back again to Amenhotep, a rare example of a Smi-Menu inscription naming. Tutankhamun appears on the base of the same lion. This inscription is frequently cited because it refers to Amenhotep III as Tutankhamun's father. It states that the lion was created by Tutankhamun for 3 deities: Amun-Re, lord of the thrones of the 2 lands; Atum, lord of Heliopolis; and Aja, the moon god, who at Soleb was associated with the lion and with Amenhotep III. Given the presence of this inscription, explicitly crediting Tutankhamun with restoration work and his well-known efforts to align himself with the legacy of Amenhotep III, it seems highly plausible that the restoration of Amun's images and the recarving of inscriptions at Soleb were carried out under his orders. These restorations included reinstating Amenhotep III's personal name in cartouches that had previously been altered by Akhenaten to repeat only his father's throne name, Nebmater, which was seen as more theologically acceptable. Roughly 120 kilometers downstream from Egypt's present-day southern border with Sudan lies the temple site of Amada, built by Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. The temple was dedicated to the worship of Amun-Re, alongside the solar deity Rehorekti. In the temple's reliefs, Rehorikti appears as a man with the head of a falconiform, in which he was also venerated during the early years of Akhenaten's reign. Peter Brand has proposed that Tutankhamun may have ordered the restoration of Amun's images at this location. However, no inscription has been found to support this theory, and the stylistic features of the heavily deteriorated reliefs do not align with art from the period immediately following the Amarna era. In fact, the scholars responsible for producing the facsimile edition of the temple's decoration noted a striking similarity between the restored depictions of Amun and those from the later Ethiopian period, though they acknowledged that such a date for the restorations is clearly untenable. Restoration of reliefs and inscriptions on the eastern bank of the Nile at Thebes. Monuments located on both the east and west banks of the Nile at Thebes in the city itself and across the river in the necropolis were among the most closely tied to the worship of Amun in all of Egypt. As such, they suffered the most extensive damage during Akhenaten's campaign against the god. The destruction extended beyond royal sculpture and temple reliefs. Privately commissioned statues placed in temples and the decorations within individual tombs were also defaced. Tutankhamun's restoration efforts at Thebes were largely devoted to fulfilling his religious obligations to his divine father, especially given the extensive damage inflicted under Akhenaten in several temples dedicated to Amun. However, the task of restoring Amun's name and image on the statues of officials, as well as in the tombs of private individuals, was not undertaken by the crown. These acts of restoration were instead carried out at the discretion and expense of the families to whom the monuments belonged. When restoration work began at Karnak Temple to repair the damage caused by Akhenaten's reforms, the primary focus was on scenes and inscriptions along the ceremonial routes used for religious processions, rather than in more secluded areas of the complex. At the time of Tutankhamun's accession, what is now known as Pylon 3 served as the main eastern gateway into the Karnak precinct from the Nile. Over 3 decades ago, William Mernan identified Tutankhamun as the ruler who added small-scale figures of himself to the east face of the third pylon's north wing. The complete relief depicts a grand divine bark, with symmetrical scenes showing Amenhotep III presenting offerings to Amun inside a shrine on the deck. Tutankhamun's additions show miniature images of himself standing behind Amenhotep III, participating in the ritual. Mernan convincingly attributed the later erasure of these smaller figures to Horemhab. That of the artisans working on his behalf is also apparent in the series of smaller scenes decorating the hull of Amun's bark, which show Amenhotep III in acts of devotion. These vignettes are believed to have been completely as replacements for scenes previously damaged, likely under Tutankhamun's orders. Later modifications to the images of Amun, though not those of Amenhotep III. Point again to Horemhab's interventions. 3 rare Simwa menu inscriptions bearing Tutankhamun's name appear beside scenes of Thutmose, 3 before Amun and Mut, on the eastern face of the structure now referred to as the 6th pylon in Tutankhamun's day. This was the 4th gateway along the east-west axis, leading toward the sanctuary at the heart of the temple. On either side of the doorway, the reliefs show Amun holding Thutmose's hand and offering the sign of life to his nose. In these scenes, as in others throughout Karnak and Thebes, the figure of Amun previously defaced was initially on a slightly smaller scale than that of the accompanying king. Not long after this work was completed, the god's figure was slightly enlarged, likely during the same phase in which Horemhab altered the inscriptions to credit himself rather than Tutankhamun with the restoration efforts. Additional instances of such secondary restorations have been identified along the temple's processional axis, including what may be reworked divine figures in the decoration of Hatshepsut's obelisks, later claimed by Seti I through inscription. At the time of Tutankhamun's accession, the southern entrance to Karnak Temple was still under construction. The pylon that Amenhotep III had begun had only reached 8 courses in height before his death. Brought work to a stop, processions entering Karnak from the direction of the Mut precinct to the south would have passed through what is now known as Pylon 8 once again. It was William Mernan who identified Tutankhamun's throne name among the restorations on the scenes depicting Amun's divine bark at this location. These scenes were later modified first by Horemhab and then by Seti, both of whom replaced Tutankhamun's name with their own dot, an inscription found on 2 blocks from the doorway of a granary, titled Amun Rich in Provisions, also attributes restoration work to Tutankhamun. Although the granary had originally been built by Amenhotep III, its exact location within the Karnak complex remains uncertain. During Horemhab's reign, the structure was dismantled and its blocks were reused in the reconstruction of a chapel, dedicated to Amenhotep II, positioned between pylons Ix and X near the sacred lake. This area of the temple was where offerings were prepared and consecrated, and Tutankhamun himself commissioned reliefs honoring deities related to provisioning. On a wall nearby, after ascending the throne, Horemhab focused attention on this sector of the temple. He constructed the 9th pylon, decorated the 10th, and adorned the interior east wall between the two, where he reinstalled the chapel of Amenhotep II. It was likely during this period that Amenhotep III's granary was dismantled. However, evidence suggests that this was not Horemhab's initial plan. Tutankhamun's inscription, asserting responsibility for the restoration, reveals that the original intent may have been to preserve the structure while merely modifying its texts. The cartouche bearing Tutankhamun's throne name, Nebkapor, was smoothed out to allow for reinscription. Yet, before this replacement was carried out, the decision was made to dismantle the entire building instead. Another granary built by Amenhotep III appears to have stood outside the temple enclosure. This mud-brick facility featured a design incorporating 3 grand sandstone gateways adorned with painted reliefs. Many of these relief-decorated blocks were later reused in the construction of the 2nd pylon, a project carried out under King Horemhab. So far, Suzanne Bickel has documented over 50 such blocks from the original gateways, though many more are likely still embedded within the pylon itself. While this granary differed in both size and location from the one known as Amun Rich in Provisions, contemporary records indicate that the management of these types of installations was likely interconnected. Gateways showcase the ornate, elaborate style characteristic of Amenhotep III's reign. Their decoration followed traditional themes, including depictions of the king before Amun, while the lower portions featured kneeling fertility figures, offering trays piled high with provisions. During Akhenaten's campaign against traditional cults, his agents not only defaced images of Amun, but also targeted the fertility figures, possibly, as Bickel has suggested, to symbolically strip Amun's worship of the abundance these images were meant to guarantee eternally. In the period following Akhenaten's reign, these reliefs were restored. The repairs carried out under Tutankhamun are easily identifiable. Unlike the bold high reliefs of Amenhotep III's era, these restorations were rendered in the refined low-relief style typical of Tutankhamun's time. This stylistic distinction confirms that the restoration work was commissioned under his rule. Even though no Smoy menu inscription, explicitly naming him, has been discovered on these particular blocks, before turning to the evidence of renewal activity under Tutankhamun, at Luxor Temple, one final monument from Karnak deserves attention. The upper portion of a stela discovered at the site shows Tutankhamun presenting a tall bundle of flowers and papyrus to Amun, Mut, and Senwuzrat I, the second ruler of the 12th dynasty. Senwuzrat's I's involvement in temple construction at Karnak is well known. On this stela, however, he is portrayed in the artistic conventions of the New Kingdom. He wears the blue crown and a fashionably pleated kilt that drapes to mid-calf features that did not exist in his own time. Although most of the inscription, beneath the lunette, is damaged. The first line is sufficiently preserved to reveal that it begins with Tutankhamun's Horus name. Otto Shadon previously remarked that the text makes reference to renewals. Since then, Nozomu Kawai has undertaken a detailed study of the stela and plans to publish a facsimile, drawing along with a translation and commentary. Evidence of secondary restoration efforts can also be found at Luxor Temple, where extensive building activity had taken place during the reign of Amenhotep III. The first phase of restoration following the Amarna period was initiated by Tutankhamun, possibly coinciding with the start of the relief carvings in the Grand Colonnade Hall, which had remained undecorated at the time of Amenhotep III's death. This may represent yet another instance of Tutankhamun attempting to associate himself with his illustrious predecessor. Within the solar court of Luxor Temple, as well as the hypostyle hall beyond it, the restoration work originally carried out under Tutankhamun was later modified by Seti I, who inserted his own Smyrmenu inscriptions as part of these revisions. On the western bank of the Nile, at Thebes, his restoration efforts by Tutankhamun would reasonably be expected at several key religious sites. These include the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, as well as Deir el-Bahri and Medinet Habu, both of which were central locations for major festival processions, particularly those involving the annual journey of Amun to the Theban necropolis.